Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Pieter Humphrey. I'm a Principal Product Marketing Manager at Pivotal, working on the Spring team and Cloud Foundry teams. I am lucky enough to be joined today by one of the newest members of the Spring Boot team. Madhura, would you introduce yourself and maybe tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got here?
Okay, thank you, Peter. So hi, everyone. My name is Madhura Bhave, and I am a developer on the Spring Boot team. Like Peter said, I just joined this team a few months ago, and before that, I was working on Cloud Foundry, more specifically the user authentication and authorization component of Cloud Foundry, also known as the UAA. That product, so UAA is a Spring project. It's one of the few Spring projects on Cloud Foundry, and I think I was lucky enough to make the switch to Spring Boot and get to work on some awesome Spring Boot and Cloud Foundry integration as soon as I joined.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, we're excited to have you. Cool. So today we're going to talk about Spring Boot, the new Spring Boot 1.5 release, and talk a little bit about how that works on Pivotal Cloud Foundry and some of the exciting things that we are doing as a joint engineering team. But before we get into that, let's just kind of do a quick little recap of what's been happening in some of the latest releases. Just obligatory safe harbor statements, since we are going to be talking about a little bit of forward-facing roadmap information. You'll notice the conspicuous absence of dates and such. Just realize that some of this information is forward-facing and may change. We'll make it very clear when we get into the forward-facing information, though. Should be pretty obvious. Cool. So let's talk a little bit about, start off by talking a little bit about what happened in Boot 1.4, in case you missed it. We're going to focus on Spring Boot 1.5 and some of the great stuff that Phil Webb, Madhura, and the rest of the team have put out in that release. And then we're going to show you some demos about how that works on Pivotal Cloud Foundry and some interesting integration we're doing there, inspired loosely by CodeCentric, their Spring Boot admin tool, which is an open source tool that's available. But we used it as a design point for the integration that we're doing in Spring Boot and PCF. So, and then we'll finish that off by kind of just looking ahead in the large, not only for what's coming for next for Spring Boot and Pivotal Cloud Foundry, but also kind of pulling the lens back a teeny little bit and looking at some of the other interesting things in Springdom that have some cool integration points to Pivotal Cloud Foundry. So with that, let's get started. Great. So Spring Boot 1.4, a couple big themes there. There was a bunch of improvements on error handling. We made some incremental improvements to the actuator, and some improvements around data, and as well as a fair amount of improvement around testing. So we got a whole separate slide on that. The error handling bit is pretty straightforward. We added some things around what we're calling failure analyzers. Basically, it tries to simplify the diagnosis of some common startup problems. So rather than just getting a nasty Java stack trace, we're trying to kind of analyze these stack traces and give you not only a slightly more sensible error message, but try to give some remediation guidance. My favorite example is the one that bites me in the tushy all the time, which is I start a process and oops, the process was already in use. That port was already in use by somebody else, and I kind of forgot that I left maybe a Tomcat server or a Jetty running on 8080. I boot something, it's trying to bound to 8080, doesn't work. So trying to get in front of that and give you better quality error messages, basically. We provide a number of these failure analyzers out of the box, and they're extensible, so you can write your own. The other interesting thing is the convention-based error pages, which is kind of nice. You're basically the ability to drop in a custom 404 page just kind of by convention. So if you wanted to register a custom 404 page, for example, you just add it, you drop a 404.html into a path like source main resource public error. So it's just kind of convention-based. And then you can add in static HTML or a template in that correct location, and it just automatically creates a mapping. So that's pretty cool. Makes error pages a little bit easier. The data support basically is just saying that we are adding some new auto configurations for Neo4j, Couchbase, Redis, Redis Spring Data and repositories. And also, Hibernate 5.0 is now the default JPA provider. And then lastly, we just refreshed our Elasticsearch integration to include the Jest, J-E-S-T, Jest client. My favorite thing is the actuator. So that you can customize and contribute additional items. So now, out of the box, we support things like the full or partial Git information that gets generated from a Maven or Gradle plugin, build information that's generated from the Spring Boot Maven or Gradle plugin, and then any custom environment information, any property that starts info.star, basically. Also, we refined the /metrics endpoint a little bit so that submissions can be sort of merged and grouped together. It makes it a lot easier to read. So that's just a quick recap of some of the major features in 1.4. The other big thing was the testing support. So that actually was a pretty good overhaul of what we did in in earlier versions. We introduced the notion of test slices and things of that nature. For 1.4, now we're basically trying to bring that auto configuration simplicity to testing. Making it really easy to test a slice of your app. So if we're going to give you a slice for your data layer, or perhaps a REST client, or maybe JSON serialization. The other thing that we're adding is basically auto-configured mocking. So with the @MVC test annotation, you can kind of auto-configure your way through mock MVC, which is pretty cool. Spring Boot can essentially automatically create mock beans and manage the lifecycle for you with no setup. So, it's a pretty decent overhaul of the testing support. Test classes and utilities are now provided in a dedicated Spring Boot test and Spring Boot test auto-configure jar file. We've added things like assert.j, JSON assert, and JSON path dependencies to the test starter, and provided a simpler sort of unified Spring Boot test annotation for use with Spring's JUnit runner. We can also now auto-configure a lot of these tests, meaning that you just have to do less configuration up front. We've also introduced dedicated annotations for @JSON test, @WebMVC test, @REST client test, and @data JPA test, so that you can quickly get to those slices that I referred to before, something for your data layer, your REST client, JSON serialization, things like that. And like I mentioned before, there's also now some much better Mockito integration. So it makes it just a whole lot easier to mock or spy Spring Beats. And of course, the most requested and my personal favorite feature, and of course our main evangelist Josh Long's favorite feature, is banner images. Now, if you have a picture of your CIO or your CXO, you can definitely drop it into Spring Boot now as is, and it will come right up on the boot screen. If you just need to try to help get your project funded, you can make sure you've got a picture of your CIO right there on the boot screen. They'll love that. Or you can go with the cyan cat, which is my personal favorite and Josh's personal favorite. But in either way, you can just basically take an arbitrary image file and it'll render an ASCII art banner, which is stupid cool. Just drop a banner GIF, banner JPEG, or banner PNG file into your source main resources, and it just automatically gets automatically converted to ASCII, which is just the coolest thing ever. Good. Sorry, hold on, screen lag here. Yeah, so that's just a super quick recap of what's happened in 1.4. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Madhura to talk a little bit about the release that she's been working on that has just been out for a little while, the Spring Boot 1.5. Madhura, you want to talk to us a little bit about some of the highlights?
Yeah, sure. So one of the exciting new features that was added to Spring Boot 1.5 was the support for Apache Casca. for those of you who haven't heard of Apache Casca, it's a distributed messaging system. And one of the key differences between Apache Casca and the traditional message brokers is that with Apache Casca, you can actually go back and reread messages because it's the consumers that are maintaining a pointer to the log of messages, whereas with traditional message brokers, once the message has been produced by the producer, it's basically gone. Spring Casca is the project that provides Spring core concepts to Kafka-based messaging systems. And Spring Boot builds on top of that by providing auto-configuration for Spring Kafka. It's super easy to now get started with your Kafka project in Spring Boot, and I'm going to walk you through a quick demo of how you can do this. So let's switch over to the demo.
Right, because before we only had it available as part of Spring integration, right? Now you can get to Kafka right from Spring Boot.
Yes, that's correct. So now it's a first-class citizen, and you can directly configure your Spring Kafka by Spring Boot. So what we have here is a very simple Spring Boot application. This is your application class. It has the regular Spring Boot application annotations. I'll go over the enable Kafka annotation in detail a little later. But as you can see, it has the main method, which launches the Spring application. What we have here is a sender class, and the sender class gets injected with a Kafka template. The Kafka template is provided to you by the Spring Boot auto configuration. It provides convenience methods for sending messages to the Kafka broker. And here it's configured to send string messages. So the send method over here, which is scheduled to run every second, is going to send messages using the Kafka template on this topic. So the topic is called string topic. And the message that we're going to send is just message appended with a counter. Just to give you an idea of what this demo is about, it's more about how Spring Boot makes it easy for you to configure Kafka and get started with it versus deep diving into the internals of Apache Kafka. And what I have lined up here is a few commits, and we're starting off with the initial commit, which is just sending the string message. And in this receiver class, we are going to consume that message. So this receiver class has a method that is annotated with @KafkaListener. The @KafkaListener annotation marks this method to be a target of the Kafka message listener on this topic. So over here, you would do your processing and decide what to do with the message. But for the purposes of the demo, we're just going to log that message. To enable the processing of this Kafka listener annotation, we have the @enable Kafka annotation over here on the application class. So if we run this app now, I already have a Kafka broker and a zookeeper running in the background. So as you can see, it's printing out received message 1, 2, 3, 4 as the sender sends it. The receiver over here, which is receiving on this topic, receives the message and prints it out. So that was pretty straightforward. The one thing I forgot to mention over here is to get the Spring Kafka auto configuration, you need to just add the Spring Kafka dependency either in your POM XML if you're using Maven or in your build.gradle if you're using Gradle. Next, let's look at a little bit about how you can configure Kafka. So I'm going to check out the next commit that I have here. And the difference between this and the previous version that we had is that now the sender is configured to send an integer message over to the Kafka broker. So I've changed the topic name in topic, and instead of sending message a string, I'm just going to send the counter. And now if I try to run this application, so as you can see, since I've changed the name of the topic, my receiver is also listening on int topic now. If I run this, you can see that I'm getting a serialization exception here because I'm trying to send a value of class integer, but the string serializer fails to serialize that. And one of the things that we get with Spring Boot is the ability to configure properties very easily through properties files. It's a Spring Boot feature called configuration properties that lets you do that. So we can easily fix this serialization error that we're getting here by adding these integer deserializers and serializers in our application properties files. So now if I run the application, so that's the only change we had to make in order to be able to send the integer message. Now if I send it, you can see that the receiver is printing out the integer message that it got. So it was super easy to get started with Kafka, configure a few properties. There are a bunch of other properties that you can configure, and they're all under the spring.kafka prefix. So you can look at the documentation to figure out which other properties can be configured. Okay.
Cool. We got some questions from the audience about this, but let's address them at the end. So folks, just have patience. We're seeing your questions. We're just going to address them at the end if you don't mind. So rest assured, we've if you're entering stuff in, we've seen it. So please feel free to keep doing so. Sorry, Madhura. Back to me, I guess. Great. So let's. Actually, no. Sorry. My apologies. This is you. So, Madhura, yeah, let's talk a little bit now about the actuators in Spring Boot as a preface for some of the integration work that we've done.
Yes. Thanks, Peter. So one of the other things that we did as part of Spring Boot 1.5 was to change the security model for the Spring Boot actuators. But before we get started with the security model, I want to talk a little bit about what the actuator endpoints are. The actuator endpoints allow you to monitor and interact with your Spring Boot application. So if you have the Spring Boot actuator dependency added to your application, you get a number of built-in endpoints, and you could also add your own if you wanted to. Some examples of the built-in endpoints that you get are the health endpoint, which gives you application health, info, the environment endpoint, which gives you information about the Spring environment, metrics, trace, audit events, and a number of other endpoints, but we won't go into the details of each one. As you can tell, a few of these endpoints can potentially expose some sensitive information. So your env endpoint, because it shows you the properties that are in your Spring environment, there could be something in there that you probably don't want to be available to anyone who can access these endpoints. So what was the security model for the Spring Boot actuators before 1.5? I'm only going to talk about the actuators that are exposed via HTTP. We can also have JMX, the actuators exposed over JMX, but we're just going to talk about the MVC and the HTTP ones over here. So before 1.5, if you included the actuator dependency in your application, or maybe you didn't include it intentionally, but it got added as some kind of transitive dependency, and say you didn't have Spring security in your application, at that point, the actuator endpoints were all open. And by that, I mean that anybody who had access to the URL and knew where your health endpoint was or where the env endpoint was could hit that endpoint and see everything that the endpoint had. So if you unintentionally did this, say it came in as a transitive dependency and you didn't want to add Spring security to your application, you could have ended up in a situation where you have these potentially sensitive information all exposed. Whereas if you added Spring security, you would get to log in with a default username and password, but not everybody wants to add Spring security, and having default exposed endpoints was probably a little scary. So in Spring Boot 1.5, we decided that these actuator endpoints would be secure by default. And by secure, I mean only allow access to users with the right permissions. So now if you have the actuator dependency and you don't have Spring security, you get an unauthorized error when you try to access the endpoint. If you do have Spring security, you will get basic authentication, where you can log in with a default username and password to access these endpoints. So that basically prevents unintentional exposure of these endpoints. But say you do want to expose these endpoints, you feel that they're okay, this information is okay to be available to any user of your application or anyone, any public user, you can disable the security for these endpoints by simply setting a flag. The flag is called management.security.enabled. And if you set that to false, Spring Boot will back off, and you can either leave the actuator endpoint insecure, or you can add your custom security configuration. Okay, so the next new thing that we added as part of 1.5 was the loggers endpoint. And the loggers endpoint is actually a new built-in actuator endpoint. And what it does is it allows you to view and modify the log levels in your application at runtime. So you can get all the loggers in your application. You can get an individual logger, and you can change the configuration for a specific logger. I'm just going to show you a quick curl example of how you can change the logger configuration at runtime, along with what the output is of the loggers endpoint. So again, I just have a very simple Spring Boot application over here. And it has the actuator dependency. So if I go to the /loggers endpoint, I can see a JSON of, first it shows me the log levels. So the loggers endpoint supports all the logging systems that are supported by Spring Boot. So logback, Joule, log4j2. And it shows me the log levels that are possible to configure for the current logging system that's being used. And along with that, it shows me the list of loggers, and it shows me the configured level for each logger and the effective level for that logger. So I can filter by a single logger by doing that. And over here, you can see that this logger has a configured level null, but an effective level that is given to it by the logging system as info. Now, if we want to change the log level for this logger, I can do a curl to the loggers endpoint with the logger name. And the data that I'm going to pass here is going to be the configured level. Let's set it to debug because right now the effective level is info. So that's a 200. And now if I view the logging configuration for this demo application logger, I can see that the configured level has changed to debug, and effectively the effective level is also at debug. So this hopefully gives you an idea of how easy it is to change the logging configuration for your application at runtime. Okay, so now that we've seen a little bit about the actuators and the new loggers endpoint that we've added, let's move on to the Cloud Foundry support that was added as part of 1.5. So as part of Pivotal Cloud Foundry 1.9, we added some Spring Boot Actuator integration through the Apps Manager UI. So if you deploy a Spring Boot 1.5 application to PCF 1.9, you will see additional information about the application in the Apps Manager. So a few things that you see that are listed here are the boot application, the boot icon, which can be an eye catcher to indicate that it's a boot application, augmented health information, Git information. The runtime configuration of loggers that we just saw can also be done through the Apps Manager UI. And all these things are secured by the core authentication and authorization component of Cloud Foundry, which is the UAA. So the user doesn't have to configure any additional security for the Spring Boot actuators when deployed to Pivotal Cloud Foundry. We can walk through the Apps Manager UI to take a look at how these things work. So what I have here is the Apps Manager running on Pivotal Web Services, or PWS, which is the hosted version of Cloud Foundry by Pivotal. This is my actuator app that is the Spring Boot 1.5 app, which is pushed to PWS. And the eye catcher that I was talking about earlier is the Spring Boot icon. So I can easily tell that, okay, this application is a Spring Boot application. The instance health over here is augmented with additional information from the health endpoint. You can configure your application to add some custom health indicators. So over here, I've just added a custom Hello World health indicator. But in your organization, if you have some kind of custom services that you want to report the health for, you could add a custom health indicator. Another cool thing that has been integrated into the Apps Manager UI is the Git information. So a lot of times you want to know which Git SHA this application was built from, and you can't really tell. But with the Apps Manager, you can actually click on this link over here, and it'll take you to the Git commit that this application was built from. So it gets this information from the info actuator. And to do that, you have to configure a few things, but I think those are mentioned in the docs, which Pieter will talk about later. In the Settings tab, you can see this additional Spring Boot information from the info actuator. Currently, it's in this raw JSON format, but there might be plans in the future to enhance the UI for this. So again, over here, you can see the Git information, the commit that this application was built from, the user, etc. The Logs tab has configurable logging levels. So if I go to configure logging levels, you can see the list of loggers that we previously saw for that the Spring Boot application that was running standalone. You can further filter the loggers by name. So I'm going to filter it to this scheduled logger that I have over here. and change the logging level to debug.
Getting a couple of questions to increase the size of your text.
Oh, sure.
I don't know if you can do that in this screen, but yeah, perfect. Great, thank you.
Sure. So as you can see, I changed the logging level for the schedule logger from info to debug. And if I save that, let me, the logs are not, I'm just going to refresh this to see if I'm getting the log. Sorry. It's loading, so it's going to take a sec.
In the meantime, maybe I can address one or two questions.
Oh, there
Oh, we got it? Okay.
Yep. So let me see if my configured log level show up. So it's at debug. And if you can see over here, it's printing out these logging statements from my schedule logger. And these are only printed out in the debug mode. So because I changed it to debug, I'm now getting those log statements. Yeah, so that's it for the PCF and actuator integration for right now. We have a few things coming up, which Pieter will get to in a second.
Thanks, Madhura.
Oh, sorry. I actually wanted to talk a little bit about how this works. So the way it works is we have, with the Spring Boot 1.5 release, the actuator module now includes additional support that gets activated when you deploy to a compatible Cloud Foundry instance. So the same actuator endpoints that we see in a regular Spring Boot application, they also get exposed via the /Cloud Foundry application path. And the reason why this is a separate path is because this path is protected by access tokens from the UAA. And further, it is protected by the Cloud Controller role. So only if you have certain roles in Cloud Foundry, like say the space developer or a space auditor, and people who are allowed to view this application on Cloud Foundry, only those roles get access to these actuator endpoints. So it's a transparent security integration between Apps Manager and the UAA and the Cloud Controller, which does not require any additional security configuration by the app developer. A few other 1.5 highlights that I want to go over were the addition of the audit events endpoint. So the audit events endpoint is another actuator, and audit events get recorded for authentication and authorization events, but you can also record your own events using the audit event repository. So now we have a JMX endpoint that allows you to query previously recorded audit events over JMX. And we also have a /audit events NDC endpoint to get these events. As far as LDAP support goes, we now provide auto configuration for any LDAP compliance server. And for easily testing your LDAP in your application. We provide an in-memory LDAP from Unbound ID, which allows you to test LDAP without really needing a real LDAP server.
Great, thank you, Madhura. Okay, let's talk a little bit. Let's look ahead a little bit, and we have a ton of questions. So Madhura and I are trying to speed through this quickly so that we can get to those. I've been researching some of them while you were talking, so we've got a few answers in queue already. So let's look ahead a little bit. And we are very interested and excited. Phil and the rest of the team are really hard at work on Spring Boot 2.0. Obviously, that will come out and be released subsequent to Spring Framework 5.0's GA release, of course. Just looking ahead at Spring Boot 2.0, irrespective of Pivotal Cloud Foundry integration, obviously, this is going to be the release that supports the Spring Framework 5.0 reactive concepts and the Spring Web Flux web framework, reactive web framework. This is what's going to make your full stack reactive app a little bit easier to bootstrap, typical sort of Spring Boot auto configuration. Mechanisms will be available, as you might expect. Obviously, Jürgen and the rest of the team have been very closely tracking Java 9 release for some time now. And we will be supporting Java 9 in Spring Boot 2.0, of course. Java EE 8, there are some JSRs, obviously Servlet 4. 4.0 is an exciting JSR for sure, as that affects, a good chunk of the Java universe there, as well as bean validation. So those are things we're definitely tracking very closely and will be supported in Boot 2.0. The other thing, of course, is this is typically a bit of a rolling delivery, but at GA time, at release Spring Boot 2.0, we'll start by focusing on sort of the major generation updates of various Spring projects. So a Spring Integration 5.0 or a Spring Session 2.0 or something of that nature, as opposed to a point release perhaps, or something more minor. So you could expect some of the major top-level Spring projects to be Boot 2.0-ified right at release. Also, the main sort of, I think, answer, when I was originally chatting with Phil Webb, the team, Brian Dussault, Stéphane, Rawson, and everyone, and I kind of asked them, I was like, what is, what's sort of unique about the Spring Framework reactive approach? Why would someone sort of maybe choose us as opposed to some of the other reactive options out there? And I think one of the really strong answers that's coming through is the ability to plug and play the different runtimes available. So as you may or may not be aware, Apache Tomcat is certainly working hard. You may or may not even realize, actually, that 75% of the Apache Tomcat code base is written by Pivotal employees. I think there's 3 or 4 people. I think we've added some new folks lately, but Pivotal's actually, employees are actually responsible for a majority of the Apache Tomcat code. And they're hard at work on reactive non-blocking servlet implementations, right? Obviously, there's Reactor Netty. If you've worked with the Netty before, that's always a popular one. Jetty and JBoss's Undertow. So, and possibly others. These are the reactive runtimes that we're going to be focusing on for Spring Boot 2.0. Great. So this is exciting. Madhura and I were talking about this yesterday. What's coming ahead just for the actuator integration that she was showing you? Ben Hale and the rest of the team are hard at work on the next incremental set of boot actuators and surfacing those in Pivotal Cloud Foundry's Apps Manager, which is the user interface that you were seeing earlier. Actually, to be completely technically accurate, Madhura was showing you the Apps Manager from Pivotal Web Services, which is our hosted public cloud instance of Cloud Foundry that's available to any Spring Boot developer. If you sign up, you get, I think, about $87 of free trial credit or something like that. So it's a great place for Spring Boot apps, test dev environments, spare capacity for CI builds, that sort of thing. So that's what she was showing you. We're working on that next set of Spring Boot actuators, things like heap dump, thread dump, and trace. Are currently what's in plan, but we're not 100% committed there yet. We're still kind of going back and forth and deciding what makes the most sense for the next release. The heap dump is pretty straightforward. This just returns a gzip compressed heap dump file. Dump is pretty straightforward, makes a thread dump. Trace just gives you the last information, the last 100 HTTP requests by default, and the trace information in there. So those are coming soon to a new Pivotal Cloud Foundry release near you. And on the fullness of time, we're certainly going to be going for the complete set of actuators and surfacing those in the Apps Manager user interface. So basically the only two that we're not going to instrument are shutdown and log file. And Madhura yesterday to me explained why, which makes perfect sense, because you can shut down the boot app from within Apps Manager, so you don't necessarily need the shutdown endpoint yourself. And the log file, well, Logaggregator in PCF does an amazing job of streaming logs from multiple Spring Boot instances and multiple containers across the PCF system and making it kind of appear as one log stream. We call that component Logaggregator. So there's no need really to dump out a log file when you're running on PCF. Logaggregator does that for you automatically. Also, we're looking at the PCF metrics team. If you're unfamiliar with PCF metrics, I'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute. But it's just kind of some operational data, container metrics, network in, out, CPU usage, that sort of thing. And those metrics are going to get piped from Spring Boot Actuator. If you define custom metrics, the PCF metrics team is working on surfacing those in the PCF metrics user experience, which is really cool. Some things that are kind of more on the radar, not even remotely committed to yet or anything like that, but we're kind of musing about and really want to hear from you, frankly. Ben Hale has been considering reactive actuator endpoints. We're also looking at a microservices dashboard, Ordina's JWorks. Josh Long did a cool webinar on that a few weeks ago with the Spring Tips series. And there's an awesome little visualization dashboard for your microservices, so we're kind of looking at that as well. But really what we do want to do is hear from you. If you are a Spring Boot user and a Pivotal Cloud Foundry user or a Pivotal Web Services user, traverse that link, and you can apply to have an interview with our user experience team, and they'll give you a $75 gift card for participating. The form is literally like 3 fields. But if you're using these two things together, now is your chance to sort of influence product management around this directly and have your voice heard. We're very, very interested in talking to you. Cool. So let's pull the lens back just a teeny little bit from just sort of what's the Spring Boot and Cloud Foundry scenario. When you widen the lens to a little bit wider in Springdom, there's something that we've done with some great Spring Cloud integration that you may or may not be familiar with. You've probably heard of it by this point. But Spring Cloud Services is basically the server-side components of Eureka, Netflix OSS, Eureka, Hystrix, and our config server, which is sort of your Git or HashiCorp Vault as a configuration service over the network. And these are 100% BOSH managed, PCF managed instances. So no longer do you have to sort of install and configure and even manage Eureka Hystrix config server over multiple containers. This is now, as of extremely recently, live in public beta on Pivotal Web Services. So you want to give it a spin, you just go right to run.pivotal.io and you can give it a shot on pretty cool stuff. We are thinking about all kinds of crazy things for the future, and we want to hear from you what you think, what sounds interesting to you. Some of the things that are being talked about in product management right now, we're talking about things like composite backends for configuration server, where you can mix maybe HashiCorp Vault and Git together. We're looking at direct support for Spring Cloud data flow as part of Spring Cloud services. Those runtime pieces, usually when we're talking about Spring Cloud services, we're usually more talking kind of about the server-side bits for now. We're also coincidentally investigating how to make that easier for client development, but that's another topic. Other things, supporting some of the new, very recent Pivotal Cloud Foundry features that have hit the market, like surgical routing or the new container-to-container networking stack. Also, maybe improving the collaboration around our service registry. Often we found that teams want to collaborate in ways that don't necessarily just map to CF orgs and spaces. So that folks might want to actually be able to see service registries from other groups. So we're considering some arbitrary linking concepts to allow people to more easily collaborate. And then another thing on the sheet, evolving the config server into a slightly more self-contained configuration management product. Maybe we would actually provide a backend configuration database rather than, sort of bring your own Gits or bring your own Vault, and lots of other things to sort of make it a little bit more turnkey, even a little more turnkey. Last thing, and this is one I'm personally most excited about, and I think is really interesting, is the dynamic routing for the service registry, where we might look at auto-provisioning and pairing Zool instances for your Eureka instances, so you can do things like content-based routing, and actually would be the foundation of an insane amount of other features, things like canary deploys and stuff like that. Although, in some aspects of that are already supported, of course, in Pivotal Cloud Foundry. But that's basically, as you can see, a pretty vibrant and exciting roadmap for Spring Cloud Services. And we think this is pretty unique in the market. So we're looking to hear from you. A few other things, again, pulling the lens back a little bit wider. Let's shift the focus away from Spring Cloud Services for a second and just talk very briefly about some of the work they're doing on the PCF metrics team and with Spring Cloud, specifically with Spring Cloud Sleuth. This is our framework that sort of wraps some of the Zipkin tracing capabilities for Spring Cloud. And the idea is that if you've enabled that and basically PCF metrics, which is sort of your operational data view, and shows off things like container metrics, CPU memory, disk usage, network metrics, how many requests per second, that sort of stuff, application events, an app was created, updated, starts, stops, crash, application logs, that sort of PCF metrics in like a 2-second nutshell there. But, that's your operational data. And the idea would be that if you turned on some of the Zipkin tracing, PCF metrics is going to detect that data, those span IDs and those trace IDs automatically in the logs and start to integrate it into this sort of user interface, which is kind of presented as a time series, as you can see there in the screenshot. So especially when you're doing microservice architecture where you've got potentially lots of different services, understanding the complete call graph, the latency for each component is going to be really important. So this is going to help you find all the logs that have that trace ID. What services did it touch? How long? What was the timing on that? And of course, the call hierarchy. So this is some work that hasn't hit the market yet, but it's stuff we're very actively working on, and it's fairly mature, and certainly would love your feedback on. Yeah. Great. So let's move on. Yeah, let's move on to our last slide, and let's start to take some questions, folks. We've got about 10 minutes left and a ton of questions, so this is great. Thank you for all that. Let me start right off by addressing the wrong link there. That apparently there was a erroneous link on the documentation. So I'm just displaying that now. That's the correct link for the Spring Boot Actuator docs. And if you're a Google fan, you can just Google for actuator, Spring Boot Actuator on docs.pivotal.io, and you'll get right to it. That's another way to get to it pretty quickly. Great. Hang on one second. I just got to keep track of a lot of questions, folks. So just need to keep track of some of these things. Good question. What versions of software do we need to be able to get all this good stuff for the actuator integration? Basically, this is Spring Boot 1.5.1, I think, and PCF 1.9.
Yeah, so it's Spring Boot 1.5.1 and PCF 1.9. That's right. And if you want to play around with it, you can also use PWS, that's Pivotal Web Services, which is the hosted version. And I believe you can sign up for a free trial and deploy a Spring Boot 1.5.1 app to it.
Thank you. Okay, and notice someone else saying that the survey link was down. We'll address that right away and get that survey link back up if you're interested in a user interface interview. Just one second, and yeah, hopefully we'll get that back up very quickly. So maybe check back in about 5 minutes. Thank you for commenting that, by the way. Okay, great. So yeah, appreciate you calling that out. Thank you for reporting the bug. So let's see. Question was, there were some Kafka questions earlier too. I'm going to get to that in just a second. There was one question on how does Spring Boot on PWS differ from Spring Boot microservices. So the answer to that is, I mean, Spring Boot can be used to create microservices by itself. Spring Cloud is an extension to Spring Boot that provides you a bunch of tooling and infrastructure to help you do microservices more easily. Running Spring Boot on Pivotal Web Services, the difference, you know, I mean, microservices are an architecture, and Pivotal Web Services is a deployment platform, really. So you're sort of saying what's different about apples and oranges there a little teeny bit. It's just when you're running Spring Boot on Pivotal Web Services, you're just running it on our public Cloud Foundry instance, and you know, just doing the usual cloud things, right? You know, you pay for what you use. You know, you're obviously not deploying to a local server. You're deploying to something remote, and what you deploy, whether it's a microservice or not, is sort of up to you, right? So hopefully that helps. Question on where can you get the survey link from? It is in the if you look in the attachments and links section of your user interface, there is a link to it. Someone just reported, however, that there was an issue with the survey link for some reason, but we'll get that back up for you in no time. So maybe just check back a little later today. Give us a few minutes, and we'll make sure that that's up for you. If you're interested in an interview, we very much like to hear from you. Great. Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, totally. And thank you for reporting it. Okay, great. Is there another question? Is there an out-of-the-box Splunk integration for logs, metrics, admin changes? For things, okay, a little bit of some text munch there, but I think you're asking for out-of-the-box Splunk integration. Pivotal Cloud Foundry has its own sort of log creation capabilities, but I believe there is some Splunk integration. Personally, I would have to double-check that on network.pivotal.io to make absolutely sure. I have a vague recollection of it, but I don't want to give you the wrong answer there. So you might just want to go to network.pivotal.io and take a look for any sort of a Splunk integration file. But we do provide some log aggregation capabilities. I think where Splunk shines is a little bit more on the log analysis front, which is not what Logaggregator does. So it kind of depends what you're looking for, really. You know, if you're kind of grappling with that decision. I would take a look at the Logaggregator documentation and see if that has sort of your just enough feature set, or whether you need something that is really full-blown log analysis. Let's see. Okay, hold on just a second. Ooh, questions coming in fast. All right, I'm getting the top of the stack, and I feel like I'm being unfair to some of the people that asked questions at the beginning. So I'm now going to go to the bottom of the question stack, where we had a few questions on Spring for Apache Kafka, which our engineer Gary Russell was very kind enough to answer back channel for me. And there was a question about Spring for Apache Kafka was, can you create a new listener where the topic is defined at runtime? And the answer to that is yes. You can either create a Kafka message listener container object, or if you're using Spring integration, you can use the domain-specific language, DSL. There's a dynamic flow registration capability there. So if you're using the DSL, it's dynamic flow registration. If you're not using the DSL and you're coding Java onto the command line, you create a Kafka message listener container object. Sorry for the long name there, but Spring is not known for short names. So hopefully that helps you out there. And another question, is there a Spring Boot starter Kafka? I think you mean, is there a starter for Spring for Apache Kafka? And the answer to that is yes. On start.spring.io, there is a checkbox for Spring for Apache Kafka. That is the starter, I think. Or am I going nuts, Madhura? Or is that my off base there?
I think the Spring Boot starter that they might be asking about is like the Spring Boot starter actuator or all those kind of things that we have. And I don't think we have one for Apache Kafka. The thing that you're talking about on start.spring.io is you can add your Kafka dependency when you're creating that application on start.spring.io. But I'm not sure about the Apache Casca starter.
Okay.
I don't think it's there.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. Nice catch. Recommend and why? The question on Spring Kafka and RabbitMQ, which would you recommend and why? That's one of my favorite questions lately, actually, and I think Madhura nailed it when she said that Kafka is really designed and built around a very particular, somewhat narrow set of use cases, but it really kicks butt for those use cases. It's a durable message store, so you have a cursor in it, and you have this concept of being able to kind of go back in time and say, hey, what were the last bunch of messages? Like your consumer code needs to keep track of where the cursor is, whereas in traditional enterprise message brokers like RabbitMQ perhaps or something else, when you DQ a message, when a consumer DQs a message, it's gone, right? And there's a lot more sort of guarantees and acknowledgments and transactionality and things like that built into that kind of exchange. So for super high volume use cases like kind of an event fire hose, Kafka is great. For a lot of the other enterprise sort of garden variety enterprise use cases, you're going to probably find that RabbitMQ is mature enough for you and is covered. It has what you need. They're pretty complementary in a lot of ways because I think what Kafka's strengths are not Rabbit's strengths, and a lot of Rabbit's strengths are not Kafka's strengths either. So I actually see them as really quite complementary. I think you just need to pay attention to what's your use case and answer it from that perspective. But there's a great blog entry on Pivotal.io from Fred Mello about this exact thing and about some of the use cases that each message broker is core competencies. So if you do a search for Fred Mello, Rabbit, Kafka on the Pivotal site, you'll find that article right away, and you can get some additional detail. But I just kind of summarized it for you as fast as I could. Great. One or two, another question on Kafka was, is there a Kafka server embedded for Spring Kafka? And the answer to that is yes, but it's a development version, so you don't really want to use that for production. Another question was, is the Spring Kafka support available to apps that are not using boot? Yes, they are, but it's just you're manually, you don't get the benefit of the auto configuration and all the other stuff. You're sort of manually doing it yourself. So you certainly can. If you're just using raw Spring Framework and not Spring Boot, you can definitely still do that. Let's see. Bunch of other questions. Oh, I think I answered this already, but there was a question of what version of PCF Elastic runtime do I need to support the actuator integration. I think we addressed that it was Spring Boot 1.5 and Pivotal Cloud Foundry 1.9 or up. Okay. Someone else asked if we had already covered microservice creation and how to deploy. No, we did not, and that was sort of outside of the scope of this webinar. If you are interested in that, there are some awesome videos that cover exactly that topic. One of my personal favorites I would recommend is Josh Long's Cloud Native Java. If you go to the Spring YouTube channel, and there's a link for that right on the screen in front of you, spring.io/video, you'll find the you'll talk about you'll find some videos from Josh Long on Cloud Native Java that covers exactly that topic. Another question on the App Manager in Pivotal Cloud Foundry. Is the App Manager an open source application that I can install? And the answer is no. That is something that comes with Pivotal Cloud Foundry. You can certainly get access to it from Pivotal Web Services if you're not a PCF user, but it is not an open source app that you can install. No. Excuse me. Okay, looks like we're making some good headway. Hold on, I'm just going to take a quick break for 1 second and run back through the log and make sure we're getting everything here. Okay, very good. All right. We are going to run out of time in just about literally about a minute and a half. So unfortunately, I think I'm going to have to, I really want to continue to answer all these questions, but literally the system is going to cut us off in 3 minutes. So rather than having an extraordinarily abrupt end to the webinar, I'm going to log out. I think we can save your questions, and the ones that I'm not able to answer, if you want to try to hit me up on Twitter, I'm easily findable at Pieter Humphrey, or you can just hit Spring Central and we'll try to address your question. I'll try to address your question there. Maybe follow me on Twitter or something, and we can pick up. In the meantime, now would be a great time in the last few seconds we have here just to check out those attachments and links, and definitely try out the public beta of Spring Cloud Services and the container networking for Cloud Foundry. That's pretty hot. And then, if you're a user of both technologies, please, by all means, sign up for the user experience team interview. We'll make sure that link is back up and working in just a couple minutes here. So maybe check back a little bit later today, and you're more than welcome to sign up. If you have any questions on that, please feel free to hit me on Twitter, at Pieter Humphrey or at Spring Central. And I think that's all we have time for today. I really appreciate the questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. We just have too many. And look forward to seeing you on another webinar very soon. This week, this is being recorded, and the slides and replay will be published to the Pivotal website and the Bright Talk channel. So if you want to share those with your colleagues, they're certainly available for you. And we encourage you to come back and check the Pivotal.io and Spring.io website for future webinars. We're really ramping up on the webinar program all across the company, so there's all kinds of cool stuff happening every month. Great. Okay, Madhura, is there anything you want to say to kind of sign off?
Just thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar. And if you have any follow-up questions, you can follow me on Twitter and ask me over there. My Twitter handle is it's Madhura Bhave 23. I believe it's at the beginning of the slide deck, so you can get it from there. Thanks. Bye.